From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And for you today, an extended conversation with K-State's Drew Ricketts on contending with coyote predation on livestock. Drew will discuss the nature and behavior of coyotes, including some things that you might not have known about their preferred diets and how that changes over the course of a year. And he'll cover the various approaches to coyote damage control, including hunting, capturing, and exclusion from livestock areas. Lots to go over there with Drew. We'll do so next. Further ahead on this week's Milk Lines, K-State's Mike Brouk touts the use of specially designed blankets for protecting young dairy calves as the weather continues to turn colder. That's what's ahead on this Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. We're glad to have you aboard. On this segment, we will venture into the area of wildlife management, and one of the primary items of interest and even issues with our livestock producers out there in particular, but others as well here in the state of Kansas, and that is the prevalence of coyotes and their activity. And eventually we'll talk about means of controlling coyote damage. Along with us is Research and Extension Wildlife Management Specialist here at K-State, Drew Ricketts, our first time to visit with Drew. So welcome to you, first of all, Drew. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Eric. I'm glad to be here.
Coyotes, are they continually a subject of interest amongst landowners?
Yeah, they are for sure. We get good attendance at the coyote meetings that we have, and I get a lot of questions about coyotes. Everything from folks in urban areas that are reaching out about seeing them more often, all the way to sheep producers, goat producers, and cattle producers that are losing young livestock to predation too.
That prompts the question that a lot of folks have had in recent years. Are coyotes more prevalent, and are they more acclimated to human activity than they have been?
Definitely more abundant. When we look at the numbers that Wildlife and Parks has available, I can pull up a graph here. I brought my coyote presentation with me just because I figured we were going to talk about some numbers, but they have tripled in abundance since the late 80s. So definitely a lot more common. We also see a lot more in urban environments. There was a study done in Manhattan and Junction City with camera traps that found that coyotes were relatively common within the city limits of both towns. And, you know, they're relatively abundant in areas that are as urban as Chicago, Portland. There's some neat videos out there of coyotes on public transportation. I've seen video from some coyote researchers in Chicago that indicates that the coyotes might be learning how to use street signs and stuff like that, going and waiting until the light turns green before they cross intersections and things. So it's very interesting stuff.
They're learning to navigate the urban landscape. That's impressive.
Yeah. And
the question then always arises, why are they so numerous and why are they so brazen, to put it that way?
Yeah, and I don't think that they're necessarily brazen. We have to be careful about thinking about animal behavior the same as we think about human behavior. And I think one of the things that has allowed coyotes to be so successful is they're just very adaptable. You know, we typically think about coyotes as being predators where they're really omnivores. They eat a lot of insect matter. They eat fruits. They eat vegetables. They do eat lots of animal matter too, but they're also good at capitalizing on human byproducts like trash and things. So in cities, they're very well able to make a living.
Anything that explains the population boom, though?
One of the things that folks like to talk about and at least think about is the lack of harvest relative to what it used to be. And, you know, when we look at the abundance trends, they've definitely increased threefold since the fur boom ended, the fur market crash in the late 80s. But when we look at other predators that were actually more popular fur items during that time, we don't see the same thing. We also see big popularity that has increased in hunting coyotes and I don't think there's as many people probably trapping them as there were at one time, but a lot more people are hunting them than used to be. So I think it's sort of a combination of coyotes becoming better and better at taking advantage of the changes that we've made to the landscape and learning how to capitalize and live in an urban environment too.
As you say, they're sharp. They're adapting then.
For sure.
So to coyote predation control, one of our primary interests in Kansas agriculture, and you do get calls on a fairly regular basis as per sheep, goat, and cattle losses?
Yes, all three. And, I've been in this position for about a year, and our contacts, at least on the wildlife side of extension, have been down during COVID, so we're not getting as many contacts overall about coyote predation as Charlie did, 3 or 4 years ago. But it's probably half of my calls have to do with predation at some level. It's not always predation. Sometimes I look at pictures and determine that an animal was, stillborn or something like that. But we do get peaks in contacts from producers during lambing time. And it's not just lambing time. It's when the lambs are small during the summertime when coyotes are raising pups and they have that demand for larger food sources. And then also, we get cattle producers reaching out about losses to predation during spring and fall calving season. So the calves are really at risk only for, probably a couple of weeks, whereas the lambs and kids are at risk for a longer period of time because calves are sort of at the top end of the normal prey range for a coyote, from the beginning.
Is that a matter of the size of the animal as opposed to, say, kids or lambs? For
sure. Yeah, if you think about a lamb or a kid, they're much closer to the size of a deer fawn, which would be natural prey for a coyote, whereas, bison calves would be the equivalent of cattle calves, and that's about the biggest critter that a coyote would have fooled with, naturally.
Before talking about control measures, it's always interesting to learn a little more about coyote behavior. The numbers they run in, when they're running, when they're active. You mentioned some of the primary times when they need added nutrition. What are the things that stand out there?
Well, I talked a little bit about how they're really good at capitalizing on whatever food is available. And so wild coyotes are going to eat whatever's most abundant at the time. And so during the summertime, there's probably not a whole lot of hungry coyotes because they're eating June bugs when they're abundant. They're eating grasshoppers. They're eating cicadas. The spring and the fall are when we often see peaks in abundance of the rodents that they prey on, which is the primary food source that coyotes capitalize on would be rodents and rabbits. And then into the early fall, then we start seeing some of the wild fruits like plums in other parts of the state, persimmons and those sorts of things. And then, through the winter, they're going to spend most of their time eating those rodents and rabbits again. And then in the spring, that's when fawns and those sorts of critters become available too. So that's kind of how their food habits change throughout the year. When we think about coyote behavior or social structure, there's sort of two classes of coyotes. There's resident coyotes that have territories, and that's going to be a family group. It'll be a male and a female, one or two of their offspring from last year that they let sort of hang around to help raise their pups from this year. So, it's November right now. A typical family group this time of the year would include the male and the female, some of the pups from last year that haven't dispersed yet. And this is about the time of the year when they start kicking out those older pups that they let hang around to take care of the new pups. So, family group's probably 4 to 5 coyotes right now.
And then you have the transient coyote.
Yes. And those transients are, bird researchers would call them floaters. So they don't have a rigid territory. They're sort of nomadic. And so they've got this huge area that they're roaming over that might be up to 10 times as large as the home range of a resident coyote. And they're basically trying to keep from getting into major conflicts with the resident coyotes. They're waiting on a resident to die or to no longer be able to defend their territory, and they're going to fill that spot. Basically, 50% of the coyotes in Kansas are probably transients. So for every coyote you remove from the landscape, there's one waiting to fill its shoes. The other thing that coyotes are able to do is we call it compensatory natality. So they're able to adjust their birth rates to compensate for persecution, basically. And so when coyote abundance is high and they're basically eating all the food that there is, our average coyote litter size is going to be 3 or 4 coyotes per litter. When we have a big removal effort, and so the population is low relative to the resources that are available, they can double that litter size up to 8 coyotes per litter.
Before we take a quick break here, Drew, the numbers in which coyotes will run of a night, and their calls would suggest they're in the tens of coyotes at least, but that's not often the case, is it?
That's not the case. What you're referring to is what we call a group howl when we talk about their vocalizations, and that group howl, there's some really neat videos on YouTube if you Google them and look those up, but one coyote can sound like 4 or 5, and so those group howls, it's typically going to be 2 to 4, and one coyote, like I said, can sound like 4 or 5. So when we talk about 2 coyotes, now it starts sounding like 10 and so on. So yeah, it sounds like there's a lot more than there really are on the landscape, for sure.
It gets people excited.
It does,
sure.
Yeah.
We'd like to take a quick break here, and then, Drew, when we come back, get into some of the control methods to cut down on the predation on livestock by coyotes.
Sure.
Drew Ricketts is with us, Extension Wildlife Management Specialist here at Kansas State University, and we'll return to talk more with him shortly after you hear this. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. We're back now on Agriculture Today, and once more across the way is Drew Ricketts, Research and Extension Wildlife Management Specialist here at Kansas State University. Failed to mention earlier, and we might do so here since his name has been dropped a time or two. Almost a year ago now, Drew succeeded longtime wildlife specialist here at K-State and a weekly guest here in this broadcast, Charlie Lee. He and Charlie worked together for several years before Charlie retired last December. So when the name Charlie is mentioned here, you'll know whom we're referring to. We are talking coyotes, their predation, and the control measures that one can take to hold that predation down. Drew just shared a bit about their behavior and their tendencies, and that all weaves into the control measures that we're going to get into today. There are several options at hand. One of them is hunting, as you mentioned, and that is a consideration out there, Drew.
It is, yeah. One of the things that we have to think about when we're considering what control measures to use is the fact that it's really hard to do population control on coyotes. We talked a little bit about their social structure, and in a normal year, the pups that were born this year aren't going to breed next January or February. When there's a lot of resources relative to the number of coyotes, most of the yearling females will breed. And so not only are we doubling our average litter size, we're also introducing a very large component of the female population that doesn't normally breed is now producing pups. So when we think about controlling coyotes, we don't want to think about population control because it's not effective. We've been trying to eradicate them for a couple hundred years and haven't been able to do it. What we need to think about is eliminating the culprits or those individuals that are causing us problems.
And how are they identified then, or can they be
singled
out?
It's pretty hard to single them out, but what we try and do is focus our control efforts on the areas that are having problems. And so, if somebody enjoys hunting coyotes, they should keep doing that. But we don't want to try and just reduce the population in order to prevent problems. We want to address the problems once they occur. And so if we're thinking about hunting, then we want to call coyotes in the areas where we're having problems once those problems start. And basically we're going to keep calling and hunting those coyotes until the problem quits. From talking to Charlie, I haven't been in this position a long time, but from talking to Charlie, very few of his problems were ever actually taken care of through hunting. It's typically trapping that has taken care of those problem animals, and that's just because when we're trying to hunt coyotes, we're not getting anything done unless we're out there hunting them. Traps are working 24 hours a day, and so they're a little bit more effective at dealing with the problem animals than hunting typically is.
Let's move right into that then.
Sure.
There are different approaches to trapping and preferred approaches?
Mm-hmm. There are, yeah. The two main methods that we would think about would be using footholds versus using snares. The snares can be very effective when the person is trained and knows what they're doing. They can also be dangerous. If we're snaring around sheep and goats, those sheep and goats actually can get into the snares that we set for coyotes. They're typically going to be set low enough that they wouldn't bother cattle. So that's one concern. Another concern is that a snare set for a coyote is typically going to be able to catch a dog. And so if we're trapping around a farmyard, if we have livestock guardian dogs and those sorts of things, we need to be really careful with snares. They're a very effective tool, though, and we can sometimes catch coyotes that are a little more wary with a snare that maybe we missed with a foothold trap. The nice thing about foothold traps is they rarely do very much damage or cause injuries. And so if I catch a dog, if I catch somebody's sheep, as long as it's not a really, really small sheep, I can turn it loose. And they might have a sore foot for a few days, but they're not going to be any worse from the wear. I get to make that decision as an animal control specialist. With the foothold traps, we've got some good videos that Charlie and I put together on YouTube, on our KSRE Wildlife Management YouTube page. It's kind of hard to describe the process of trapping, of how to set a trap over the radio, but
it's best to view.
Yeah, exactly. And even when I'm giving coyote programs, I oftentimes will show that video because I can't demonstrate the process in front of a group all that well.
But placement of the trap,
yeah,
that's fairly critical to effectiveness, isn't it?
Placement's critical. You know, there's an old adage in trapping that you always want to set on sign. So we're looking for coyote tracks. We're looking for coyote scat. We want to be in areas where they are moving through fairly regularly. So we're looking for multiple sets of tracks and that sort of thing. And then there's certain areas on the landscape that we can target for locations like pond dams, two tracks, you know, places where coyotes are going to take the path of least resistance. And so if there's already a trail there, that's a good place to look for sign. Also, when we're thinking about doing control work, focusing on areas that are close to where we're having the problem, that can be very important as well.
One of the things, though, that sometimes arises is the thought that coyotes have been the source of the predation when, in fact, it was something else. And those distinctions can be made, can they not? They
sure can. And that's one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is looking at pictures to determine the cause of death before I decide if I'm going to go out. We get a lot of reports of animals that are preyed upon by mountain lions in Kansas, and most of them don't turn out to be even predations. I had one of those recently that I looked at, and you know, there's things that we're looking for in those pictures, like, just as an example, I just looked at a calf picture recently. The calf had been opened up, its abdomen had been opened up, the scavenger had eaten muscle off the ribs, it had eaten part of the loin, but there was no blood on the ground. There was a clear pool of blood inside the carcass. There was no blood on the outside of the carcass anywhere, and there were no wounds anywhere other than where it had been opened up. And it was pretty clear that from some other things that I looked at too, like the color of the hooves and whether there were any abrasions on the hooves and that sort of thing, this calf hadn't even ever stood up. Or if it hadn't walked around. And so it's important not to just assume that an animal was preyed on if it's been eaten on, because a lot of them are just scavenged.
And don't assume what, if they were preyed upon,
exactly
was the source of that predation.
Yeah.
And therefore, professional confirmation is very helpful indeed. And there's one other aspect, Drew. We could talk about many more things here, but the option of attempting exclusion to keep coyotes away from livestock. Depending on the location and the circumstances, that might be an alternative.
It is, yeah, and especially if we're thinking about sheep and goats. When we don't have really large pastures that we're trying to contain animals in, a good, tight, woven wire fence that goes all the way to the ground is sort of the first line of defense in a sheep and goat program for sure. And the other thing is if the terrain is relatively flat, coyotes are going to dig under that fence in specific areas, and then we can target those spots with snares or foothold traps. If the fence is shorter than 6 feet, coyotes can still jump over them, but they typically will take that path of least resistance. And so if there's a crawl under spot, that's a spot where we can target them for sure. Guardian animals are kind of along the same lines. You know, they are there to exclude coyotes from the herd. Whether or not that's the category that they fall in, I'm not sure, but guardian animals can be very effective if they're well trained. We see dogs more than anything, but of course llamas can be effective, and donkeys can also be very effective too as long as they're trained well. The problem with donkeys is if they're not trained well, they might kill more lambs than the coyotes do.
Well, we haven't covered all aspects, but we would let folks know that you avail yourself to answer questions about coyote predation and control for anybody that has an issue out there.
Yep, and they can reach me if you look up the Extension Wildlife website, which is wildlife.k-state.edu. There's a contact link on there. My phone number, my email is there. And then we also have a new fisheries and pond specialist, and so his contact info is there as well if anybody has any pond or fisheries questions too.
Don't hesitate to use the resources that Drew and company provide if you have a coyote problem around or nearby your livestock herds. Drew, thanks for the visit right here. Good information. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
That's Wildlife Management Specialist Drew Ricketts, K-State Research and Extension. And while we have a moment here to build a bit on what Drew mentioned, that website that is an absolute reservoir of information on wildlife management, including just about all you would want to know about a long list of species, from bats to wood rats and everything in between. You can also learn about the preferred habitat for each species or multiple species. They've a couple of manuals on that site worth a look, one covering nuisance wildlife damage control and the other on private lands wildlife management, all the aspects that go into succeeding with that. And not to overlook the Wildlife Habitat Education Program for youth. Details are covered there as well. Go to wildlife.ksu.edu. You'll likely find something of interest to you there. We'll be back shortly on Agriculture Today. Next up on this Tuesday edition of Agriculture Today, the weekly feature for you dairy producers. Milk Lines, K-State Research and Extension Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk reminds us this week about that cold weather stress that's starting to set in and why you producers might want to tend to dairy calf comfort around now. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the use of calf blankets and the advantages to your animals over this winter period. As we approach winter, calves and calf health becomes an increasing issue on our dairy. So, what are some things that you can do to improve your calf's health and also their rates of gain during the winter season? You know, there's been several studies that have looked at the results or the impact of using calf blankets. Calf blankets have been around for a while, and we do see them on many of our dairies, but a lot of our dairies still do not use them. So here's some things you might want to think about. One study that looked at using calf blankets or not using calf blankets for the first 21 days of life found that there was about a 0.3 of a pound average daily gain advantage if the blankets were used. In another study, the advantage was a 0.5 pound average daily gain increase just for using blankets for the first 2 weeks. That's about 7 pounds per calf during that 2-week period. pretty important when you think about how little those animals are actually gaining during that period as well. Another thing to consider is, how does it actually affect the calf's temperature? One study actually did look at that. They put blankets on calves and they followed their body temperature for the next 4 hours. During that 4-hour period, those animals that were blanketed experienced an increase of about 0.4 of a degree Fahrenheit in body temperature. This is pretty significant when you think about the cold stress that our animals actually undergo during the time that they're being milk-fed, and especially in the first 3 weeks of life. So how long do they actually have to wear these blankets to get the benefit? Again, there's been several studies completed, and those studies clearly show that beyond 3 weeks of age, there's probably not a lot of advantage to using the calf blanket. So really, you're only talking about the first 3 weeks of life. Here's another thing that might get your attention. One study looked at animals that were treated versus those that weren't treated. For those animals that wore a jacket, only about 20% of the animals needed to be treated compared to 70% that did not have a jacket on. And this was in fairly cold climates in the upper Midwest. And you say, well, we don't experience quite that kind of stress here. Just keep in mind that calves, when it starts to get below 60 degrees, start to become cold stressed. And when we get below 40 degrees, we really should think about whether or not they should have a blanket on them for at least the first 3 weeks of life. The cost of doing this is not very expensive, but one of the things you have to think about is maintaining the blanket. In between calves, these blankets do need to be laundered. And it's very important that we do that to reduce the amount of bacteria that we spread from one calf to another. If you will launder these blankets and then dry them, you will eliminate that bacteria issue. And many of the insulations that we use on these blankets today actually hold up to the effects of the washing machine. So you can launder them many times and still have a usable blanket. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to utilize calf blankets during the winter period.
Thanks, Mike, and happy Thanksgiving to you and yours. Well, a quick glimpse to tomorrow's broadcast. From the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McOwen will join us once more, and this time he'll be going over a host of highly important legal considerations when purchasing farmland. And, of course, being a Wednesday, we'll hear once more from K-State's Gus Vanderhoven. He'll be in with another Stop, Look, and Listen, along with much more right here tomorrow. Please be back with us then, won't you? In the meantime, Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.